Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. Thanks for all of you online streaming in. Good to be with you. And thanks for joining us for a conversation I hope that you will get a lot out of. And so fun to be with you.
It's amazing to see you, Ron. It's been far too long, and I'm keen to get into the detail on your book, which has been out not for too long now. But there's a lot of noise in the media, right, about how we're in the middle of a trust recession, how trust is at an all-time low. What is going on with this trust recession? Lots of people think the pandemic caused it. What's your take?
Thanks. Great question. Great question. I actually think the pandemic just revealed it. I don't know that the pandemic in and of itself withdrew trust from people. It certainly made it harder to trust. Not because we work from home or we're remote, but because we saw people behave in both heroic ways and we saw people behave in really bad ways. We got scared. For the first time in a long time, we didn't have control over things. And so I wanted to know, under what conditions would people behave badly and choose their own interests first? And under what conditions would they choose to serve a greater good, to do the right thing, to say the right thing? And so I embarked on a 15-year study with 3,200 leaders that we interviewed to understand, could we figure out what would bring out the worst in otherwise good-hearted people? And if we could we predict them and could we prevent them? I think we all assume that people trust me. My most important stakeholders trust me. But if you ask yourself, why do they trust you? You might be surprised to wonder whether or not you have earned their trust. You may think, I've given them no reason to distrust me, but that doesn't mean you've actually earned their trust. Earning people's trust today, what we learned in the research is that it takes a lot more than just not lying to do that.
Interesting. So you did a 15-year study and 3,200 interviews. How did you get inspired to do this study 15 years ago? What was the root of this conversation?
Well, so my firm, Navalent, where I work, does diagnostic interviews all the time. So we had a database of thousands and thousands of interviews, and we called out 15 years of them. And using some great AI technology to really scan and analyze and quantify the data, did a deep look at, are there factors that would tell us these are the conditions that people will choose to say the right thing, do the right thing, and say and do the right thing for the right reason? And are there conditions where they'll do otherwise? And we actually in the research learned that there are 4 quantifiably, multiplicably identifiable conditions that we all as leaders and as organizations find ourselves in, sometimes hiding in plain sight, in which people will actually choose good or bad behavior. The definition of honesty in the book, we found out from the neuroscience in our brains and also socially that honesty is very closely connected to justice and purpose. So in other words, it's no longer enough just to speak the truth, but it's how you speak the truth, to whom you speak the truth, and why you speak the truth. It's also about doing the right things, about fairness and justice, right? So we've all been made aware recently of a very unlevel playing field for a lot of people. And so if you don't act with justice and dignity for those around you, people withdraw trust from you. And lastly, serving a greater good. Do you live with purpose? Do you live purposefully? So truth, justice, and purpose are the new standard for what people will hold up to you a yardstick to determine whether or not they believe you are honest or not.
So you mentioned these 4 organizational factors hiding in plain sight that you discovered. What are those?
So first of all, be who you say you are. What we don't realize as humans is we are often, we wear our values on our sleeves. We tell people who we are by our actions, by our choices, by where we spend our time, by who we don't spend our time with. And in so doing, we signal to people that we value certain things. When we behave in ways that conflict with those values, even inadvertently, we tell people they can't trust us. We tell people that we're not a safe place for them to predict who we'll be because they can't tell which versions we're going to get. All of our companies have value statements, they have promises, they have missions and visions, and a lot of times you say the values, people just roll their eyes. Well, what that's telling you is that your culture has shaped duplicity. It said, around here, we say one thing, but we do another. And so that's perfectly okay for you to do as well. So we encourage duplicity even without realizing we're doing it. So ask yourself, when there is a say-do gap in your life, do you know it? Do people tell you? When you tell people you value teamwork, you value compassion, you value diversity, you value inclusion, do your actions reflect those values? And can people If people followed you around with a video camera all day long and videoed you, could you be used as a training film for that value? I worked with a client recently who told me, whose feedback said he lost his team's trust. And he was shocked. He said, I've never lied to them. I'm always straightforward with them. I always include them. I said, well, apparently you say you all for one for all, as teamwork is really important to you. But apparently in meetings, if people don't speak as efficiently or quickly as you want, you become a little bit sarcastic and a little impatient with them. And so what they've concluded is they can't bring their full voice to you. And he said, well, everybody has a bad day. I said, well, you apparently have a lot of them. And if you continue to tell people you value teamwork, which means you value their voices, but then behave in ways that belie that and discourage them from speaking, you're actually telling people you're not trustworthy. And he had never made the connection that that behavior could ever dilute the trust he'd earned of his team. He assumed he earned it because of a certain set of behaviors, but he hadn't earned it on the behaviors that mattered to them. Second is decision making, so how we make our choices. How transparent are you when you make choices with loved ones, with people on your team, with people you lead? How trustworthy are you that people understand and can decode why you chose what you chose? If your decision making is secretive, if your decision making is a ruse, how many of you have ever been to a meeting where you walked in under the guise of we're here to make a decision or solve a problem, and 3 seconds in you realized, oh, they already made the decision yesterday, and this is just orchestrated theater, right? Trust is gone. So think about the way you make your choices. Whose voices do you include? Whose voices do you exclude? What data do you choose? What data do you ignore? All of that is telling people how you make your choices and whether or not you're reliable or not. The third is accountability. How do you hold others accountable in your life? How do you hold yourself accountable in your life? So do you treat others who are different than you with dignity? Do you treat others, do you give other people a chance to shine? How often do you hog the spotlight, or how often do you let other people whose voices may be marginalized or who don't have a shot to shine? How often do you cede center stage for the benefit of others? If you're constantly hogging the spotlight, if your performance and your results are paramount to other people, people will conclude you're not trustworthy in terms of how it is you treat them. Most of our accountability systems in our companies are set up to announce this, sort of evaluate the same work over and over again, right? Repeatable work. That's not our workplace today. Our workplace today, the contributor is as close to the contribution than ever. What your remit is your analysis, your creativity, your ideas, your thinking. Well, if your boss says to you, I'm going to give you a 3 this year, suddenly you're like, well, I'm a 4. Our systems don't allow us to be treated with dignity. They don't treat our work as an extension of who we are. When you interact with other people about their work, about something that they've done for you, do people feel honored? Do people feel that you're grateful for their work? Do people feel as though you respect them and their contributions, or do they feel like they're a cog in your wheel? That it's a utilitarian relationship for you to get what you want. Don't assume that because you've said thank you or appreciate you or high five, good job, that people really genuinely believe that you're out for their well-being. And lastly was cross-functional partnerships, relationships with people who are different than you, right? So we all know the classic case: if you're in sales, you don't like marketing. If you're in supply chain, you don't like operations. Who are the people in your life that are they? Oh, here they come. What do they want? Because the people we other are the people who can't trust us, because we've said to them, you are different than me, therefore I don't respect you. Look at your echo chambers. Look at your social media feed. Look at the voices that are being curated for you, and look at the people whose voices you never hear. If you're surrounded by people who think like you and only think like you, there's a lot of information you're not getting, right? So how much do you go out of your way to cross the borders into places with people who don't think like you, to hear their voices, not to agree with them, but to just respect them? So who are your theys, and whose they are you? Who has decided that you're not to be respected and trusted? Your views are ridiculous. Because if you can't learn to build bridges across those divides, people conclude you're not trustworthy because you only want to be around people who think like you. So 4 factors, all part of our daily lives and all eroders of trust. If you do all 4 of those things well, you are 16 times more likely to have people trust you. But if you suck at all 4 of those things, you are 16 times likely to have people conclude you cannot be trusted.
So those are the dimensions of individual trustworthiness. What about if we think about the wider organizational culture and system? What do you see going on there?
So let's amp them each up, right? So we already talked about your company's missions and values, right? How well do you live them? How often are they part of your life? How often does your boss or do you take them off the wall and say, hey, are we living these things? Do we abide by these things? How well does your HR systems encourage those behaviors? How well do people, when they hear them, espouse them and embrace them? Or are they just cosmetically, just for marketing view only? Your meetings. When you walk into the room, into a meeting, do you trust the data that's being presented as being fair and accurate? Is the interpretation of that data a balanced one? And is your voice invited to dissent? Can you freely disagree with what's being said in the room without fear that you're going to be ostracized? Or is what's happening in that room orchestrated theater? Meaning, I'm meant to go along with what's being said. The last thing anybody wants to hear is a view that contradicts what the prevailing view is. And if I do say something, I'm likely to be ostracized for it. Governance. If your decision-making systems can't be trusted and you have to go underground to get real information, and each of these have a factor. So if your values align with your company's actions, you're 3 times more likely to have people be honest. If your governance systems, decision-making is transparent, you are 3.5 times more likely to have people be honest. Accountability systems. If you feel like your contributions are treated with dignity and honor, if you feel as though it's not a rigged game, that everybody has a chance to be successful no matter who you are or how you show up. If there are no privileged roles in your company, so if you work in a tech company, are the engineers privileged? If you work in a financial services company, are the brokers privileged? If you work in a brand company, are the marketers privileged? If you work in a high growth company, are the salespeople privileged? If there are privileges and roles that disadvantage other people, your accountability systems are corrupted because not everybody can be successful. But if the work of people is treated with dignity and honor, no matter who you are, you're 4 times more likely to have people be honest. And lastly, the border wars. If the systems in your organization allow people at different intersections to cross the border and work cohesively and collaboratively, and people are encouraged to, in fact, build partnerships across the border and not have rivalry, the classic, the sales marketing people hate each other, or the people in R&D can't stand people in logistics. If those rivalries are allowed to proliferate, now you've fragmented the organization, you've created classic silos, now you have dueling truths, right? So now it's no longer a shared truth, now it's my truth versus your truth. The goal then is for me to be right and you to be wrong. So, and that was surprising. In that case, if those exist, if those seams are stitched well, you're 6 times more likely to have people be honest. But if you have border wars, you're 6 times more likely to have people be dishonest. Again, they add up to a factor of your organization being 16 times more likely to have people trustworthy or put you in a headline you never wanted to be in.
So how do you go about designing systems to encourage collaboration? I have personally worked in a lot of really matrixed organizations where there's a lot of effort to drive cross-functional collaboration. So what are the what do you see works and doesn't work when it comes to driving cross-functional collaboration? So,
you start small, right? I mean, certainly if metrics is a big one. Right, so in one organization we worked with, it was a highly digitally enabled company, and you had one group of people who were meant to drive traffic to the website, and another group that were meant to convert that traffic to users. Right, they worked under the same digital marketing group. They competed heavily because one KPI said convert, one KPI said drive traffic. Well, they saw those as competing metrics. Right, they shared the same database of clients, they shared the same database of users, and yet they chose to inhabit their roles as if one won, the other lost, right? So if your metrics are causing people to fight, that's a deeper issue. It often appears as if it's an interpersonal conflict, but it's actually a much more structural one. Secondly is who has access to what information? Can people collaborate easily with shared data, or do they have to make things up? Here's the simplest way to start. If you know there's a colleague or a department or a team that the relationship is strained with, reach out and say, hey, look, we can do better, right? Our teams are frustrated with each other. We're arguing all the time. we can't stand the sight of each other, or we ignore each other's emails, and our service, our productivity, our creativity, our whatever it is suffering. Let's get together. Let's just talk. How can we be better colleagues to each other? And what often happens at those seams, Alison, is that those 2 functions or 3 functions are meant to create a certain particular value for the organization. So at the intersection of marketing, R&D, and customer analytics is customer service. At the intersection of customer analytics, R&D, and innovation is breakthrough idea thinking or an innovative capability. If those functions don't understand the value they're meant to collectively create, they're only thinking, this is my part of the deal. This is what I do. I don't really care. But I do my part, throw it over the wall, and good luck to you. So you have to begin by asking each other, do we understand what it is we're collectively meant to contribute together that none of us can create on our own? Once you have that shared understanding and you anchor your relationship in that value creation, then you can ask yourselves, okay, how are we going to do this? What do we have to be good at? What do we suck at? How are we going to trust each other? How are we going to resolve conflicts? How often do we need to talk to each other? What are our commitments to each other? You can actually design your relationship around that shared value. That never happens on its own. Most silos, our friend John Haidt talks about we're all tribalistic people. And so our natural affinity is to our team, which makes you they, right? So we have to broaden our definition of we to a larger collection of people so that we understand that we're all part of the same team. We're not rivals. And we have to actually design the relationship to create the value we all want to create. But if you don't do that on purpose, by default, you will pull apart.
So how much of these kind of changes you've talked a lot about individual responsibility and being honest and meaning what you say and that kind of thing. How much responsibility do you see as being individual responsibility, and how much is it about organizational design? Because a lot of the things that you've just described, I would think would be greatly encouraged if you would rethink the incentive system in the organization. So can you talk a little bit about the balance between what maybe a middle manager should be doing under their own steam versus what is the leader's responsibility?
It's a great question, because a lot of times we find ourselves in tension, right? We find ourselves, I have a particular set of values that I want to live by. My organization seems to behave in ways that discourage those. So what do I do? And so the first thing is, do your selection systems, reward systems, pay systems, how you allocate your budget, how you allocate resources, how you set priorities, do all the systems in place encourage or discourage certain behaviors, right? Your organization says it values collaboration, but all the reward systems are individual. All the promotions are individual. All the way budgets get allocated are the people who scream the loudest. You have to ask yourself, if I stay here too long, am I going to belie my own values? Because if that's the case, and there's not a way for you to influence even a small patch of your organization to at least align to what you believe, don't stay. What we learned in the research was that our brains come factory wired to be honest. Our bodies, our minds, our souls thrive when we're honest. And our health, our sense of well-being, our sense of purpose dilute when we behave contrary to those values. Unfortunately, our brains, unlike our cell phones, don't come equipped with a button that says restore factory settings. So once you are on that slope, you'll continue to erode. So we have slippery slopes. We don't have slippery ascents. So if you're in a place that's going to cause you to keep pushing a line that you swore you'd never push, don't stay. It's not worth it. Now, what can you do? So certainly over the places where you influence, even if you're a peer, even if you don't manage anybody, can you behaving in the way that is true to your values, even if they seem conflicting to the environment? Is that going to get you respected? Well, and be careful that you don't tell yourself, oh my gosh, they'll make fun of me, or they'll ostracize me, or they may not. Many people who are true to who they are get more respect, are seen as more credible. Don't do it as a jerk. Don't do it as a way that's condescending or judgmental to other people. That's not helpful. But certainly, being true to a certain value that you feel is not particularly aligned to the environment may have you stand up more as a leader. Now, it may not be a place you ever want to lead, but do everything you can to be true to who you say you are and work to align the system or invite others into that value system as best you can. If you find that you are being isolated, you are being overlooked, you're being ignored, that's a signal to you that says this environment's probably not going to be conducive to your own health and your own career, because at some point you'll conform. And then you'll wake up in 15 years thinking, how did I get here? So it is a tense balance. Obviously, what you want to ideally do is find a place that behaves consistently with what you say you believe and value.
So certainly when I talk to my students, they find it incredibly important today in a way that didn't used to be the case, that they work somewhere that is aligned with their personal values. But of course, our personal values differ depending on our politics, depending on our beliefs, depending on our culture. So how can an organization reflect the personal values of everyone within it? How do you think about organizational values when we're all very different and may have different views of what's right and wrong?
So it's a wonderful question. So doesn't that mean that our first value needs to be tolerating difference, right? And I don't mean just tolerating it as in I'll put up with you, or we have to walk on eggshells. I mean celebrating those differences. You want to make sure, the two questions you want to ask yourself is, when I go to work, A, do I have to wonder if I belong? And do I have to wonder if I matter? If those two questions are of doubt to you, pay attention. So the first thing organizations need to do is take those two questions off the table. If you are here, your work matters. And we do things to tell you that. We do things to demonstrate that your work matters and we value it. And secondly, you belong here. Regardless of who you are, what you look like, how you show up as, if you're here to contribute, we're glad that you're here. Bring all of yourself here. Doesn't mean oversharing, doesn't mean TMI, it doesn't mean bringing details into work nobody needs to hear. But who you desire to show up as, you can show up as freely without fear of having to sort of hide or quarantine or censor your identity. So I think if organizations can take those two things off the table and set the table in a way that puts people at ease about those two questions, the rest is easier. But when people have to wonder about those two things, the rest is much harder.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And you've talked then a lot about being treated with dignity and included. As we've seen over the past several decades, the gap between the pay of the CEO and the average worker has dramatically increased. So is treating someone with dignity enough, or do we need to do more structural things to, for example, correct these enormous salary and power imbalances? Well,
I think, so compensation is in the eye of the beholder. I certainly think that there are CEOs who are paid obscenely, especially when they underperform. There are many CEOs, regardless of their compensation. What I know about that role, because I spend a lot of time with them, it can also be a ruthlessly unforgiving role and a painfully, publicly torturing role. So I don't begrudge them being paid more. I begrudge them being paid obscenely. I think dignity is a two-edged sword, because if you treat somebody really well and with care and with regard, but pay them poorly, like slave wages, then you're belying that value of dignity. But what we also interestingly know is that people will leave jobs and be willingly take less money for an environment that will show them respect, regard, and dignity. I say give them both, right? If you want to keep your talent, if you want to retain the people that are important to you, pay them well, pay them above market rate, and treat them with respect and regard and dignity. Because here's the thing, we're watching this mass exodus out of the workplace, and that's not random. And what we're seeing is your best talent is quitting and leaving. Your mediocre talent is quitting and staying. So if you care about the performance of your organization, don't think you can cut corners on the experience of your employees. Don't think you can cut corners on their pay, their experience, their treatment, the regard you show them, how you honor and invite their voice, how you give them chances to shine. What the workplace is telling us today is, nope, I'm out of here. And so they've raised the bar. I don't think the pandemic caused that. I think the pandemic just revealed the fact that it's been simmering beneath their surface for those decades you've just talked about. Now people are saying, you know what, life's too short.
Right, so that's interesting. So what is your advice to a leader that says, I see this going on, but I'm having real trouble adapting to this new paradigm. Yep. The leaders I have in place aren't very good at this. I hear a lot of defensiveness from leaders. I hear a lot of views that, you know, DEI is just a buzzword that'll pass soon enough, so is ESG.
These silly entitled millennials and Gen Xers, they think they own the world.
Right.
You know what? I would love to hear that from a leader. I would love to hear a leader be that honest about the fact that they struggle with it, that they don't know what to do, that they're out of their element, that nothing in their career prepared them for this, because that will at least be an honest starting place.
Right.
And I would say you're absolutely right. You don't know how to do it, and you stink at it. Let's start from there. Now, let's talk about what you can learn, right? And let's I mean, we're not going to change this overnight, but let's talk about the fact that if you want a culture to be different, if you want your organization to behave differently, you can have that. It will take time. There's no pill you can give people. But let's talk about how we create an environment that people can belong to. How do we create an environment that shows dignity? How do we take the values on the wall and make sure we're living them? Start small. The great thing that we found out in the data is that these are not all or nothing propositions. For example, if in the area of dignity and accountability, you increase dignity and justice by 30%, you get a 15% hit in honesty. Right? So you can make incremental improvements in all four of these things. Just begin somewhere and start slowly. The last thing you want to do is start a revolution. Don't try and announce to the world we're going to turn the whole thing on its ear and change it all overnight. You won't be credible and you won't be able to do it. But start a quiet revolution and start small. And start with your own acknowledgement of, I have to change these things. I have to learn to do these things better. I need help. And let people understand that you are on a journey for your own improvement, your own rethinking of your own leadership role, and invite people around you to do the same. Once, especially if you're a CEO or an executive, once people see you as credible, as taking your own change first, it makes them more likely to want to do the same. And by the way, since you're the boss, you get to require it.
Excellent. I'd like to go back to this point you raised earlier about transparency and people feeling like everything is revealed, there are no secrets. There are companies where that transparency, I'm thinking about Google, where everybody had access to any document, that seems to have caused a lot of trouble and caused a lot of internal conflict. And I'm thinking about other efforts at radical transparency, for example, at Bridgewater and Netflix and Away and so on. And so I think transparency can feel very risky, can feel very dangerous. Are there any limits on it? Do you think it should be fully public, what everyone's getting paid? Do you put any boundaries around transparency, or you should feel it should all be on the table inside and outside?
And I think when you turn that question in personally, it becomes really obvious. Would you put your checking account and all your balance online? Would you put what's in your search bar online, right? So there is a balance of discretion, right? I don't know that companies owe their trade secrets to the world. They don't necessarily owe their balance sheet or their profit margins or where they make their money to the world. So with that, I would say, what is enough transparency? And part of what that depends on is how much trust is there in the information you've already shared, right? So I think about the leaks we've seen, right, in Silicon Valley. Those weren't an issue of over-transparency. That was a culture that nobody trusted anyway, right? In other words, the data was telling them there's a problem here. They were ignoring it, right? So good for them for being transparent, bad on them for ignoring what the data was telling them. So I think you have to ask yourself, what information do people need to know to believe that we are doing what we say we're doing and to trust us? What is that information? People don't need to comb through volumes and volumes and volumes of data, and there'll always be that person who'll want to go through it and shine a spotlight on or twist that data and make it say something that it doesn't really say, right? So you don't need to open yourself up to those kinds of people. But I do think you have to ask yourself, for the stakeholders you serve, what is the sufficient degree of information, of authenticity, of genuineness, and of vulnerability, meaning we made mistakes, right? That is needed for people to say, I trust them. I believe they are who they say they are, and I will invest my money with them. I'll buy their products. I'll be an employee for them. And that's a discretionary body of work, but you have to have a conversation with the stakeholders to find out in their eye what defines transparency. Because it's not yours to define.
So you think you should ask all stakeholders or focus on employees, or how would you go about finding out?
I think I would certainly study. I mean, because shareholders are going to want different things than customers, than suppliers, than employees, right? And so I would find out. I I mean, our data systems are sophisticated enough today that we can actually parse that stuff up relatively easily. And I think your willingness to hear from them, what would be helpful to you? What do you need to know? Doesn't mean you have to agree with everything they say or do it, but at least asking them and engaging them in the conversation of what information, what behaviors, what actions can I take, what disclosures, would be helpful to you to A, believe that we are doing what we say we're doing, that believe you can trust us, and believe that we are acting in the service of a greater good, or any good, not for our own nefarious benefit.
So you talked about understanding stakeholder perceptions, and of course we've seen this very dramatic rhetorical shift from a focus on shareholder value to a focus on stakeholder capitalism. The Business Roundtable said, we know now the purpose of business is to balance the interests of all our stakeholders. So that's very dramatic. That happened before the pandemic, yep. So that certainly supports your view that the pandemic revealed this further rather than being a cause in itself. But what do you do when there are trade-offs there? Because balancing stakeholder interests is easier said than done. What if there is a choice between you have to prioritize paying your suppliers more or your employees more? There are certainly, we can all think of trade-offs between investor interests, yep. and employee interests. So how do you consider balancing these trade-offs?
So that's why executives get paid the money they get paid, because it's painful. And the definition of leadership for me is leadership is the ability to disappoint people at a rate they can absorb. You are forever going to be letting somebody down. The question is, who will you be to them in that moment? Right? Now, if you're always letting the same stakeholder down, you're probably going to cause some problems. But in any given day, throughout the day, you're making choices, allocating resources, reprioritizing work, dealing with crises, dealing with complaints. And at some point, those relationships are always in flux. The question is, what degree of flux over time, can those relationships tolerate? This is true in our personal lives, right? You decide to go to one friend's Christmas party and not your aunt's. You decide to go to your spouse's Thanksgiving dinner instead of your mother's, right? So we're always disappointing somebody. The question is, have you built a relationship that sufficiently can hold disappointment? And because you know what? They're going to disappoint you too. Right? Your customers will defect. Your suppliers will short ship you. Your shareholders will sell. So the question is, over the arc of time, have you built relationships that allow, at any given moment, somebody to be let down? And can you look them in the eye and say, here's why I made this choice. This was the criteria behind why I chose this over this. And if it's a reasonable set of criteria, a disappointed person can go, okay. Now, do it 10 times in a row, they might have a different issue. Miss 10 of your mother's Thanksgivings and you'll have a different conversation than if you miss one. So I think you have to recognize that no single decision, no single trade-off, no single moment of disappointment is going to define a relationship. But over the arc of time, can you look somebody in the eye and say, this is why this went the way it did?
So in a large company, to what degree do those kind of personal relationship analogies translate? Because it's a different thing having a conversation with your mother about Thanksgiving to thinking about your supplier and saying, I'm sorry, you've still got to deliver despite the pandemic, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to pay you anymore, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you a longer time frame. So how do you signal trustworthiness at an organizational level?
So I think I'd rather talk to my mother. I'd rather talk to the supplier than my mother. I think the same thing applies, Alison. Again, if it's a relationship with a supplier that has you have a long-standing relationship with, you can't screw them, but you have a limited amount of cash. So get them at the table and say, what do you need? And work out this is what I can do, what can you do? And don't let it devolve to negotiation. Recognize that this is in the service of a longer relationship, right? We want to keep a relationship with you over time. This is a tough moment right now. How do we get through it together? And choose. And sometimes you have to prioritize. Not every supplier is equal. Not every job is equal. Every employee should be treated equally as a human being, but not every job is the same. Not every shareholder is the same, right? And so there are going to be a pecking order sometimes. That's okay as long as you're honest about it, right? It's when you try and hide the fact and create this false sense of egalitarianism that people get suspicious.
Okay, so it's fine to say this is not egalitarian and you're lower in the pecking order as long as you're honest about it, would be your...
I mean, that's the truth, right? It's the reality. You know, if you have one supplier that that supplies all the core goods of your main raw materials, and one supplier that supplies your janitorial supplies, those are not the same, right? Now, you should never treat them with disrespect. You should never screw them. You should never take advantage of them. But to say that these are equally weighted relationships in the service of the business that I perform and my employees and my customers would be foolish.
Got it. So can you talk a little bit about the financial dimension of this? I mean, there's a lot of noise, of course, about how, you know, short-term shareholder returns of what have got us to this point. And the focus on shareholder value, but that pressure hasn't really gone away despite this rhetorical shift. So is this a case of shareholders moving down the pecking order, or are shareholders still at the top? You know,
I mean, I think there are some people who are behaving as if they've not moved from the top, but they are, and I think that you'll get found out. You will get found out. I think it's about shareholders taking their rightful place at the table, but recognizing that, you know, there's other people at the table. I think, you know, I mean, look at Jeff Bezos has gotten away with not returning anything to his shareholders for 15 years. But he warned them about that, right? I think you have to decide as a company what kind of investment you want to be. What shareholders do you want in your portfolio? And maybe there are some shareholders you don't need to, whose money you shouldn't have. If you want to be stakeholder driven. But look at, you know, Unilever, look at Best Buy, look at the companies that have done it, right? And here's what's interesting. If you look at the ESG indexes, right, as one example, these companies, that's the best news and the data we got. These companies outperform their competitors by ridiculous margins on any metric you care about. Market share, profit margin, customer loyalty, employee retention, market share. Pick it. The companies that are seen as trustworthy, that are stakeholder driven, that are transparent, that are responsible in the communities they serve, their performance metrics, you know, over the course of time, far out deliver against their not. So my question to a CEO is, what are you missing here? You know, my dream for board directors would be to say to their CEOs, hey, so it looks as though these other companies who are behaving this way are out delivering on our, tell me what it is about this you're not doing, right? I'd love for boards to say to their all-white male executive teams, hey, just so you know, on every dimension for 30 years that we understand that diverse leadership teams outperform all-white leadership teams. So do you feel like you've done so well that you don't need to pull that lever? Because I'm curious as to why you've chosen not to do that, and don't tell me you haven't got the candidates. So why are you immune to having to pull that lever? You think we're that good? We've arrived? I would love for board directors to actually be that intrusive and ask those hard questions of their executives to say, other companies seem to have found ways to pull these levers in the service of all the stakeholders. You seem to believe that they're not necessary for you. Tell me why.
So you would, I mean, maybe the board should ask themselves that question, since they're
Absolutely.
also dominated
with yourself
by
and then hold yourselves accountable.
Right, right. So if the case is that obvious, why aren't more companies doing this?
I wish I knew. The reason I wrote this book was to sort of lay it bare and say, look, there's a good reason to do this and there's a way to do this. I mean, it's not easy, but no great thing ever was. But it baffles me. It just baffles me that people have not figured this out. We don't need to prove it anymore. We have plenty of data. That's why organizations like yours, Ethical Systems, exist, because you can show people that path. So we take some questions from our group here. Is it time for that? Oh, you have one.
Rachel.
I do have a question. Just talking about organizations and companies that feel immune to having to be trustworthy. You know, there's been like a real revolution, or surface revolution at least, in the past year plus about ethical leadership in companies, but we still see companies that kind of feel Me Too proof, or racial justice proof. The most recent example is the Activision, the allegations of sexual impropriety and all sorts of issues at Activision, and CEO Robert Kotick is just minting money for this shareholders. So, like, what do you see about that kind of company where they just don't think it's their problem?
You know, they're head scratchers, aren't they? I'm like, look around. You know, look at the headlines. Nothing is hidden from view today. I mean, with social media, we have instant. What makes you think this is going to go consequence free? It may take longer, but what makes you think at some point your employees are going to not decide enough? Just look at the titans that have toppled, organizationally and personally. You know, it's true of individuals. I mean, how many spouses cheating on their spouses think, I won't get caught? I mean, think of the silliness of that. I just have to look at your search history. I look at your phone, I see credit card bill. Like, what makes you think somehow you're not catchable? That level of arrogance, that level of hubris that says you are above reproach, you are above being caught, is, in this day and age, you have to be a complete fool to make that assumption, I think. I mean, what do you think?
Well, I mean, yeah, the world has got much more transparent, that is for sure.
I just don't understand why you would not choose to be on the right side of the story. How about you all? Any questions from you all? Or if you're out watching live stream, tweet in your questions. We'll take them.
Sure.
Hi, May. How are you?
Can you elaborate a little bit of transparency and disclosure?
Disclosure?
Disclosure and the transparency. How it is related?
So I think disclosure is sort of like is a factor of vulnerability. What do I disclose? Personally, do I say, hey, this is something I'm not good at, I'm working on it? Do I let people know? Do I say, I have a hidden disability and you need to know about that? Do I disclose mistakes? We make them. And here's the mistake we made, and here's what we're doing about to fix it. I don't think we have to be publicly self-flagellating with that kind of stuff, but I do think like that's a disclosure that makes you transparent. How many times have we seen executives, after scandals break, still trying to put a PR spin in front of a camera on something that happened, and nobody buys it? I mean, fire your PR person. What would make you think? People are listening for very specific language. Remorse, apologetic, humility, appropriate self-deprecation. And if they don't hear it, if you're sort of trying to lipstick the pig here, nobody wants to hear it. Nobody wants to hear it. People can show, I think humans can show a lot of grace. People can forgive a lot. Think about some of the things our presidents have been forgiven of. So, but not if you don't deserve it. Not if you're not recognizing or acknowledging that you have done something wrong. So I think disclosure is part of a repertoire of how you show transparency.
May I add something to it? Sometimes the business world, the companies, don't disclose everything. You found it later. Then you are in trouble.
Yes.
And you are helpless too, because you don't notify people.
I think today that the harder you try and conceal something, it's like you're squeezing sand in your hands. The harder you squeeze it, the faster it falls out. I think concealment as a strategy is probably not a good one.
Thank you for the talk. And I don't know if this is in your second book, but do you go through repair? Because you talked about earlier how when the manager finds there's an issue, they lost their trust, like repair is very hard. It's almost harder than getting it back. It's very different in it.
Yep.
Is there some type of guidance or model for repair?
Yes, absolutely. Great question. I think there's redemption. Honesty is, one of the first chapter of the book is how honesty is a redeeming force. And I think in that case, he was taken back. I made him, he had to appropriately and genuinely apologize to the individuals he'd done it to and to the whole team. But then put in place accountability processes that allowed him to change his behavior and allowed the team to point out when he improved, but also when he regressed. So for the next 6 months, we worked aggressively on making sure his posture of humility, his posture of regard, and overtly expressed his value of teamwork in ways that aligned to it. And he did. He was a good guy. He just didn't realize he was being a jerk at those moments. So I think people can earn trust back even when they, I mean, yes, it takes, we all know it takes years to build it and a minute to lose it. But people can show a lot of grace if you're willing to do the work. Forgiveness is not the same as restoration, right? Forgiveness is the beginning of restoration, and you should not assume because you've said you're sorry, you've earned trust back. You've set the stage to potentially earn trust back, but it takes time. And if you're willing to do the work and stick with it, you can re-earn trust.
Perfect.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate you being here. Thank you. And thank you all for being here online. Appreciate you.
Sorry. I was so paying such close attention that I didn't even realize it was over. Thank you so much for coming here to SaksWorks. Thank you, Ron and Alison. That was amazing. Hanging on your every word, and I really hope that basically any leader ever was too, and will continue to do so.
Yep.
Thank you so much for coming to SaksWorks. Please come back.
And there are copies of To Be Honest available to sell at the cheapest rate you'll ever get them. So, but they're great stocking stuffers. What did we say? 17? I think they're $17. So cheaper than Amazon. And I'll be happy to sign them for you if you want.
I have the Kindle one. I told you.
I'll sign a note for you, but I'm so glad you came.
Great question. Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Sorry. Literally was just tweeting and then
I saw you laugh a couple of times.
It's like, wait a second. I should come and say goodbye. Oh, pardon me.
It's great to see you again.
Thanks again.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate you, man.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anytime. It's a pleasure too. Thank you.
It's great to see you again.
Good to see you too. Thanks for coming.
Okay, I want to see, and it's a good discussion. I lost the way. I was
Oh, I'm so sorry.
By 12:50, I was walking around.
Oh.
Google gave me the direction from
Here, take one. Just take one.
dear.
No, take one.
No, give it to someone.